That's my biggest writing hurdle is my phone. Every time it pings, I just, whatever zone I'm in, whatever progress I've made is just obliterated right away.
Yeah, I got a landline for up here. I leave the cell phone downstairs a lot of the time.
You have a
So
landline still?
yeah, just so my wife can call me if there's a problem, basically.
One of the things I love about Sun Eater's future, as dark as it may be, people aren't in front of screens all day, right? Like at least they're doing
Right,
something.
it's illegal. They have to touch grass.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever interview on this channel. Actually, welcome to Shoveled Goblin is the name of the new channel, where we are going to be sitting down today with finally Christopher Ruocchio to talk about one of my new all-time favorite science fiction series, the Sun Eater series. And I just need to clarify, it is Ruocchio, correct?
Yeah, it is. It's way easier than it looks. That you gets everybody. I think I've had one person get it right the first time in my entire life, and that was an editor at Ace when she called me about maybe buying the books, and I dropped my phone and I had to scramble and pick it up, and I was like, yeah, that's me.
I got through that rite of passage then with you. I think I said Ruocchio at first, which wasn't too far off, you know.
Yeah, I get that one a lot too. My favorite was someone just gave up and said Pinocchio, and I'm like, oh yeah, there we go.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down and agreeing to chat with me here. I have been really wanting to hold off this interview until I caught up to release, which I've technically done now, despite Disquiet Gods now getting its kind of pre-release circulation. I've seen overwhelmingly positive reviews to it, so I can't wait to get to it. But it has just been a really interesting journey to catch up on. For those who are watching who don't know exactly what it is, what is your like elevator pitch for Sun Eater?
So Sun Eater is a science fantasy story, I say, just so people get their bets hedged. It's very much in the tradition of Star Wars, very much in the tradition of Dune. It's set about 20,000 years in our future in this big galactic empire, and it follows the story of a man called Hadrian Marlowe, who is a nobleman in this empire, and he runs away from home. He doesn't want the life his father has prescribed for him, and he finds himself stuck in the middle of a war between said empire and the only aliens who in 20,000 years have ever really posed a threat to it. They're called the Cielcin. They are nomads. They eat people, and Hadrian tells you on page 1 that he's the man who ended that war and dealt with the Cielcin, and his story is why and how, and about all the things that didn't make it into the official history.
It sounds like you've said that a couple of times.
Yeah, it's I was a waiter for 7 years, and I found that the skills were broadly transferable to going to conventions, which was a pleasant surprise. As soon as I realized that's actually all I had to do, it was way less intimidating. I was like, it's back to lasagna. All right, here we go.
One of the things I was immediately enamored by with Sun Eater is that this is a story that feels more like it's following a figure than just a standard man. Hadrian Marlowe, he really does feel like a Randall Thor, a Paul Atreides to me, someone who inflicts their will. We're just seeing the result of that play out for this story. What are the limits you find trying to write a character like that? Where are the successes and failures that you kind of experience trying to basically, I think it's just nice to say it's a historic figure character.
Yeah, I think really the difficulty is in plausibility, right? This was one of the things that bothered me as I started to read more and more Star Wars books as a kid, is if you read like the old expanded universe stuff, which I broadly love, right? Like the number of things Luke Skywalker saves the entire galaxy from starts to reach a certain point. And so I really think like the temptation for me is just to like bring him back after this and to do more and to make the story bigger than it already is. It's like already big enough. Just trying to keep the overall story in proportion, which is maybe not the answer that you're looking for. But at the same time, if you read historic figures writing about themselves, if you read Julius Caesar, right? If you read Napoleon's letters, are actually a really interesting case, because Napoleon is like very much actually just still a regular guy in some aspects and in some places. It's just that the context around them like gets so big, and especially if it's over time too, right? A lot of the like little biographical details will sort of fade out and die away because they're not maintained historically, right? Mm-hmm. To some degree. Like Julius Caesar is very self-aggrandizing, right? He speaks in third person in his Gallic Wars book, right? Which is like a totally normal way that people would write about themselves at the time. But it feels very grandiose. And of course you need to make yourself look good and all of that. But you have people who are more honest historically, either because you're reading their private documents or just because of who they are. And so really the story for me was always going to be the big stuff, and then the bringing the smaller character stuff in to keep him from overinflating himself, or for the story feeling overinflated, was really the the work part, right? You want to pay attention to keeping his feet on the ground, even if his head is up, God knows where. If you can do both of those, people will forgive the grandiosity for the like more human elements, right? His relationship with his friends, his relationships with Velka, whatever, right? His like tendency to bring himself down a peg for what he knows, or his more goofy behaviors. Every Star Wars movie has the "I have a bad feeling about this" line, and I have a lot of sort of memes that I insist on getting into each book, right? Someone will always accuse him of being overly dramatic, and he will always acknowledge it, right? And so I have like a checklist of like little joke things that I want to get done in every book. It's in those little things really that you balance, I think, the bigger character arc, because there's always like all these people, right? Napoleon is famously made fun of for being smaller, but he is like a normal guy in a much bigger guy's suit, right? Alexander like probably had a bunch of personal idiosyncrasies and hangups and problems that we don't really know about, because we are only really like our Alexander's biographies are so distant from him that they're more distant than the Gospels are to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Like they're like 300, 400 years later, and so we're really not seeing the man, right? And with this document, at least, right, with the series, I'm able to pretend that I'm literally giving you his perspective after he's had time to really get it. It's sort of baked into the way the book is written.
That's so you hit on something there, if you don't mind me exploring a little bit, that I find to be a wonderful element of going through this series, and that is perspective. To me, this is in a big way about whether or not Hadrian believes what he's saying or not at times. He is deeply close to the story, but also trying to come across objective, and you really get that in the pages. How did you find that balance of trying to find someone who's really, like, it feels like attempting to be honest, but maybe failing at times? Or am I just picking up on something that's not there?
No, I think that's right. I think that where it comes in is that he has a lot of like very complicated feelings about the role he's had to play, right? Because he isn't the kid that he used to be, right? He had a lot of unlearning to do in the first couple books about the nature of the world and the galaxy and the problem that he's facing in the series. But he still like wishes that kid had been right. And wishes that like his initial dream of sort of making the galaxy a better place would have been possible the way he thought it was possible. But at the same time, he knows that what he did was right and necessary because of the way he was told to do it, right? And the situations that he found himself in and the relationship he has with these higher powers and things like that. And so he has this constant rolling, crisis of conscience. And I think that often, like, people are able to be most objective about themselves when they're very clear-eyed about their faults. And I think guilt and shame are mechanisms for being able to do that. And he certainly feels guilty and ashamed of certain things that he's done, and that lets him maybe, honestly, in some cases, too hard on himself on certain instances. But that helps him from being, I think, too flat a character, because he's not just, the tendency is to think like we have like heroes, right, where like the story is just played straight, everything they do is right, basically. Maybe they do like one thing wrong and then they learn and grow. And then we have heroes or we have like, we call them anti-heroes, but they're just worse heroes, right? And who they'll do a lot of bad things, but they'll try to do the right thing. And then we have villain protagonists, which that's what an anti-hero really is, right? And then but like really, like people are all like don't fit in these categories, right? Like everybody is a lot more multifaceted than that. Stories are always about people. People always say like, oh, this is a really character-based story, character-driven story. Like all stories are character-driven. It's just a question of like, how much or how well by the writer. Like modern readers really, really like to get into characters' heads and to think their thoughts and understand their thoughts. And so I wanted to tell a story that really, really did that. I guess in sort of a cynical marketing way, I thought that would be like the right thing to do. And I think that mostly has paid off. I think his regrets really sort of drive that element of his character's clear-eyedness. He's also he's not really classically unreliable in that he's not necessarily just lying to the reader to make himself look better the way that like Alex DeLarge does or something like that, right? He's just a person, right, who has his perspectives, and those are blinkered and biased and incomplete. Like I tried to write a Velka novella a couple of years ago, and I couldn't do it because I hadn't thought about their relationship from her side that much. Because I hadn't had to, because I've been in his head. I had to go back and rethink that and re-outline everything, and I'm going to do that eventually. But because you're inside one character's perspective so much, it sort of behooves me to not step outside of that perspective in writing the story, because then he can present stuff as fact that like might be wrong, and I can then rethink it later when I do a short story, right? And be like, wait a minute, like he thought this is what happened, but like maybe like his brother, right, isn't actually as terrible as he remembers, or was more complicated than he remembers. And so that's a little bit different than people usually think when they say unreliable narrator, right?
Mm-hmm.
They think malicious, and he like is totally like concealing some things, but most of his unreliability, I think, is because he's overthinking so much, and he is. I mean, he's like all of us. He's very much in his own head.
See, that's one of the things I really deeply relate to, but it feels wrong to say you relate to Hadrian, because it's like saying you relate to Alexander the Great. Like, it's this guy, like, but there's this complement of ego and insecurity that is so human, where he can lash out at somebody in a way that I'm like, okay, like, go easier on Switch. Like, it broke my heart. But like, you know, but that's complemented by tremendous personal victories that come from this ego, this believing in oneself. And I'm wondering where, you know, you find the flaws in Hadrian. What flaw has allowed you to like do the most with this character? Like him being a bit arrogant and believing in himself enough to tank a laser to the face. Like, you know, what has been really fun to play with there?
It's usually the second order consequences of like that impulsiveness, right? You know, it's that impulsiveness that like makes a lot of his, so let's say, sort of societal victories possible, right? Because he's able to do these big things that people wouldn't normally risk. But because he does this, he creates all the subplots, basically. Like, all the people who are against him because he keeps doing these big things that aren't supposed to be possible. He upsets the status quo sort of accidentally. You can get away with a character being really, really big if you have everyone respond to them appropriately. I think this is usually where writers maybe go wrong in dealing with stuff like this, because people say they hate like Chosen One stories. I don't really believe them, because they like grew up watching Star Wars, and I know you like that. Shush. But I don't trust people's, you know, when they say what they like, because, you know, you just got to look at what they actually like. And I think where the Chosen One thing goes wrong very often is people just like have everyone still treat them like they're normal people. And usually, you know, people get trapped in this weird cycle where people aren't treating them like they used to anymore, right? You know, you see this in Dune with Korba, right, who suddenly, and Stilgar even, who become Paul's worshippers, right? They cease to be his friends. And that's like a huge loss for Paul, right? And he mourns that. But you see this in history too, you know, with figures as they become bigger, right? The people they sort of used to know become more abstract. This is what my favorite TV show is HBO's Rome, right?
Great show.
The John Milius one. It's great. More accurate historically than most productions. It's not perfect, but like it's good. But like the overall thesis was it was supposed to be about Pullo's relationship with Octavian as he becomes, you know, a god, right? Becomes, you know, Divi Filius, you know, becomes Augustus, and they didn't really get to finish the show out. But like that sort of notion of like this guy who remembered him when he was this like really annoying like kid, right? And now he's the emperor, right? Or, you know, I guess at least the princeps. And that sort of that transition is really sort of interesting to me. I you know, have characters sort of go through similar relationships with Hadrian. They go from being antagonistic to like really, really worshiping the ground he walks on, and so he gets sort of isolated, and he pays a psychological cost for this as the series goes on, and he has fewer and fewer real friends, and that's not fun, right? Like people think it's you know, romantic to be the hero or romantic to be a princess, right? You know, Disney's always sold this like false version of what being royalty is like, actually. You know, it's not fun, actually. It's not really a privilege unless you mean the food is better. You know, it actually is a really terrible job, and you can't get a new career, actually. And so viewing not just his, you know, role as hero, but his role as like lord, as the sort of prison that it is, something that I wanted to really do too. So you have all these strictures that are sort of weighing him down, and if that stuff is there, I think then the mythological stuff, the really crazy off the wall stuff, gets more of a pass from readers. There's always a balancing act in writing these stories, I think.
So you got into the psychological aspect here, which that's such a cool thing to bring up, because I found, you know, characters like Hadrian before, but they are only successful, in my opinion, when there is deep internal scarring that happens that you see then drive later decisions. I think probably one of the most well-known examples in fantasy is Randall Thor. As he gets more jaded, he gets more cold, he can't handle it, and you're kind of seeing Hadrian go through similar points. And where I just left off at the I'll call it Traumatization, the novel.
Oh yeah, that's
Kingdoms,
the one.
Kingdoms of Death. It's funny. I didn't realize someone was being sarcastic. I saw someone say this book didn't live up to its title, and I was like, oh, that's disappointing. And then I went back to the comment and I realized they were being sarcastic. So thank you for that.
Yeah, if you're gonna put that, I guess cliched a title on a book, you like really need to hit the mark. I think. Yeah, I killed a couple people, just a few.
That kind of like pivotal point where I found, not to get into heavy spoilers, you injected a feeling of hope and love in right after so much darkness, kind of that, that piercing sunlight through the storm. But it also was then tinged with sorrow and undercut immediately with more loss. Really back to back to back to back hits. What was it like as a creative process going through that? Because from a writing standpoint, I'm fascinated by that. It had to have almost been exhausting in a way to get through so much so fast.
Well, Kingdoms of Death was especially frustrating because they cut it in half on me after I finished it, which was terrible. But setting that aside, so I have a writer friend who tells me that he is like hyperphantasia, right? And that he like really feels what's going on as he's writing, like physically feels it. And that sounds terrible to me. I would not want that, especially writing Kingdoms of Death. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that like this is a thing I'm working on, right? And so I know a lot of writers they talk about their characters like they're real people and they know them and they make choices of their own inside their head. But like I don't know if it's the outlining or just a feature of my psychology. Like I'm pretty emotionally removed from like what I'm writing. Like it's not traumatizing for me to write about any of this stuff. Like it feels. I often worry that I've like not gone far enough. Actually, like have I actually sold like how serious this is, or does it just feel pat? Does it feel cheap? Like I usually am on the other side. And so what I usually feel though is like a weight of responsibility, like a duty of care really to my readers. Like these characters are as important and sometimes in certain ways more important to my readers than they are to me. Like have I done right by them, right? By the people reading the book? Because I don't want them to have come this far and feel cheated or disappointed. Like I want everyone to have a good time. Like the point of fundamentally, like, we can have as many high-minded discussions about what the book's supposed to be for or mean or what art is. But ultimately, the point is I just want everybody to be able to walk away from their life for a little while and go somewhere else, somewhere worse, but like, somewhere else. And if I do a disservice to that, I feel like I'm betraying my readers and I don't really ever want to do that. So while it's not very, very hard, it's stressful because there's a sort of responsibility factor more than there is. I do remember after I finished Ashes of Man, that one was like the exception. You read up through the end of 5, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I wrote the ending of 5. That one got to me a little bit. It's hard to write without sort of bringing yourself into it to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. And so that one, there's a character death at the end of that book that was very personal for me in a lot of ways, and so that one got me. But Kingdoms of Death mostly, I just wanted to make sure it didn't seem silly because it was like so dark that it could have gotten burlesque very, very quickly, I think.
If you don't mind me taking a little bit of a left turn, actually 2 things I need to say in response to that real quick.
Yeah,
One,
no
I just want to say it got to the point where I was making Berserk comparisons. You went far enough. I just want to say.
Okay, that was the point. That was the point. I'd always had this scene in my outline. I read Berserk in like 2018 for the first time, and I was like, well, I should just I figured putting the eclipse in was good enough for Arakawa in Fullmetal Alchemist. I may as well put one. And Sirianni had already blotted out the sun, so I figured why not.
Love the weirder elements that are in Sun Eater, and there are some moments from our characters interacting with what felt like more of a Siri than an AI and not understanding the difference, which was great. And, to just some of the beyond reality mythological elements going on. You clearly have some inspiration here that's coming from some ambitious storytellers. Is there any creative out there, artist, whether author or not, that you find really inspiring for kind of these more out of this world elements to the story?
For the weird stuff, I think it's funny. We talked about Berserk right before this. I think a lot of the weird stuff is mostly a consequence of the fact that I grew up an anime kid, right? We didn't call them weebs yet, but I was coming up in the '90s and the early aughts and stuff. So between anime and manga and JRPGs, right? I have a lot of sort of Japanese influence on the writing, and they aren't so prickly about like the sci-fi fantasy distinction over there as Western readers are. In a lot of ways, I wanted to write science fantasy in the first place because I like grew up, a pre-weeb, and so there's just a lot of strangeness that comes in from like a lot of those games. They'll do strange things, like you always end up killing God at the end of a JRPG, right? Like it's a strange thing. Games like Tales of Symphonia, like Baten Kaitos, those were pretty influential on me like early on. I'd be remiss in talking about weird and like not mentioning David Lynch. We talked about him briefly when we were messaging. I also like his Dune movie. It's not Dune, but like what it is like off and strange in weird ways. Like you got the damn cat, and I read they found part of his Dune 2 script earlier, and I'm so angry it doesn't exist, because that like Cytale playing an instrument made out of like still living human heads, and I'm like, that's gross and weird. I'm kind of here for it. I also hate it. Thank you. It's just off in a certain way. And, if I get one strain of criticism, it's for being too close to my inspirations, which was sort of the point. But I always wonder if those people have like read further than like the first half of book one, because it gets weird pretty fast.
Yes.
And like that's sort of I wanted to start somewhere familiar and go to this strange place. Yeah, if you like the weird stuff, I'll just say Disquiet Gods might be for you. It gets very weird.
If we get backwards speak in a red room, I'm in.
It's not quite there, but it gets pretty weird.
One of my favorite parts of your world building is you seem to treat references to like, antiquity myths, and then like references to what, Shakespeare, Lord of the Rings, is kind of all folded into this one. And it has this effect where like, I feel rewarded for being a science fiction fan going through Sun Eater. And what are your thoughts on the reception to that?
Yeah, second part first, I understand the people who don't like it. I think, especially early on, I went back to the same things too frequently. And I think I understand that people who go through and find like every Gene Wolfe homage and say, you lose track of it when you're writing, because you can't read the book in 2 days. You can't write the book in 2 days the way you can read it. So you're like, oh, I haven't done a Gene Wolfe thing in like 3 weeks. And actually like it was 5 pages ago, bro.
Right.
So like, I get that. As I've been revising the book for the collector's editions, I've been sort of stripping some of that out and being a little bit more proportional. So I get that, but my intention was precisely that, was to communicate that I am also a fan, right? Science fiction fans have broadly, I think, been a really poor steward of their own traditions. There's a guy I know named Ben Yallow. Ben is on the Hugo Commission, is an older guy. He's been going, I think he is now the record holder for most consecutive Worldcons that anyone's ever been to. He's been going since the 70s. I think his first Worldcon was Campbell's last. So he met Campbell as a kid, and I actually got to talk to him because he'd written a letter to the editor that Campbell wanted to pick a bone with him about. So he's like a 14-year-old kid getting yelled at by John W. Campbell about his letter to the editor, but he's gone ever since. And he would tell me all these stories, like random like folklore tales about like Frederick Pohl or Paul Anderson or Damon Knight or whatever, right? And so much of the stuff's just not recorded anywhere. And so much of the texts have also dropped out. When I worked for Baen Books for 7 years, and we did an anthology of women writers from like early science fiction. It was called Christine Catherine Rutsch edited it. It was called Women Futures Past. And we tried to do like a big PR push with it, because the story is that like, like that just what they like, these writers didn't exist, basically. Like women are only just sort of starting to get into the genre now. And this hurt my boss very badly, because she's been working in the field for 40 years, right? But also like, like C.L. Moore is wonderful, right? Lee Brackett is amazing. These are writers that like people just don't read anymore. And there's so much of science fiction history is just gone. Just nobody reads these stories. You ask a reader that's like my age, who who Fritz Leiber is, and they have no clue. They've never read Fritz Leiber, and like he was kind of a big deal back in the day. So I love a lot of these stories, and I love sort of the pre-Golden Age period, especially. And not that it doesn't have its problems, but there's some really crazy stuff in there, because like a lot of sort of the rules for what science fiction is or could be haven't gelled yet. Yeah. And I also had a science fiction class in high school. We had I went to a magnet school, so we had like a literature class that was all science fiction. It was taught by like an old capital F like Worldcon attending fan, right? So I grew up reading in high school. I was reading Van Vogt and Leiber and like all those old writers, and so I really care about science fiction as like an art form and a medium. And one of the cool things about the job is that I get people to go read Gene Wolfe now, like because older readers are familiar with him, but like younger readers have never heard of him, and he's like the best science fiction writer ever, full stop, period. I think he's just a complete genius. And
I have a really bad thing to admit right now, but I'll get to it, I swear to God.
all right. But I love him, right? And so like if you get to I get to point a finger, I get to be like reverse John the Baptist and point back at all of these older writers and say like, oh, check these guys out. The references were all supposed to be they were supposed to be obvious because like I wanted them to be works cited, not like I was trying to sneak past people's radars here. I wanted people to know that I care about this stuff and that it's cool because like you grow up reading these stories, right? And we all do this. We read a book and you're like, this is really cool, but if you had done this thing instead, that would have been better. And if you get enough of those over 15 years, you have a story somewhere, right? And Sun Eater was a response to my experience reading science fiction growing up. Like this is the story I wish that all these other stories put together would have told.
I want to get a little more into the nitty gritty of some of the actual details of the world here, because you have the Cielcin, who to my read are like if orcs and xenomorphs had a baby, and they definitely kept the eating the people part. How did you birth the Cielcin is how I'll phrase it, I guess.
Yeah, so initially, I just had I had a bunch of nightmares as a kid, and like I had these like big spooky sort of distended human figures, would show up in these nightmares. So I can't really picture things in my head when I'm awake, but when I'm asleep, completely different ballgame.
Wow.
And so like the look sort of set in from these nightmares I had growing up. And like they weren't so bad. Like it wasn't like night terror level. I'd be like, ooh, I had a really bad dream. That was, when I was awake, it didn't really traumatize or affect me that badly. But like it was enough that I'd be like, that wasn't fun. But I kind of got the look from there, and then I sort of like with everything in the universe, I would encounter other ideas either from history, because like that's like my not to sound too trite, but like history is that's my big fandom, like that's my favorite thing, or from other books or movies or whatever. I did an interview a couple of months ago now. Someone pointed out that they might have a little bit of the Wraith from Stargate in them, and that was not conscious at all, but I can kind of see what they mean. The language was weirdly a place that I kind of started with because I wanted to do the Tolkien thing and do at least one language. It's nowhere near as complete as something like Quenya or Sindarin, but it has a grammar and it has rules and stuff. I took Japanese in high school and I took Latin in college because it turned out I'm not very good at actually speaking new languages. And that's the earlier version of one of the human alphabets. I've done a better version. I've done a better version of it for the collector's edition. As it turns out, I didn't understand the Indian script that I was basing it off of very well, and so I actually because it doesn't work the way that the Latin alphabet does. So I went back and improved it a little bit. So it's like a simplified version of the Devanagari script that they use in India. But with the Cielcin language, I had pretty good grounding in like Japanese grammar, even though I kind of suck at speaking it. And my Latin is much better. I haven't really used it in a while, but it was good enough that when I was working and publishing, I would fix the other authors' Latin in their books. With one exception, David Drake was better than me. May he rest in peace. So I built their language out of Latin and Japanese, and that got me thinking about the cultures in question. Now, I've kind of already used Rome a fair bit, so it sounds bad to say I based the Cielcin initially on Imperial Japan, because like Japan is a real place, and I'm not trying to say that Japanese people are scary space aliens, but Imperial Japan was like pretty frightening, culturally in certain ways. And so there are other historical cultures that I sort of pulled from a bit. The Aztec are in there, certainly. The Assyrians are definitely in there in a big way. The Assyrians were so bad that their propaganda about themselves sounds like other things their enemies would say about them. They're just like, I took off the ears and noses of 10,000 women and put them in a pile, and I'm like, you shouldn't be saying this, Shalmaneser. But no, it's like on his billboard, this big obelisk. But I like those alien threats in stories, like the Ice Warriors, right, in Doctor Who, right, that are they have a code and they have rules. They're not just monsters for the sake of monstrosity. You can sort of almost reason with them, but it's like a very distant sort of right angle kind of reason that feels more alien to me in a lot of ways than just like, I'm just going to eat you. The Cielcin, you can talk to them, but then they will also take everyone in your village and cut their, ears and noses off and put them in a pile. And,
They have a very meat is meat view of the world.
yeah. Well, they have to, right? Because they live in these migratory asteroid clusters, and it's hard to do any kind of agriculture, and they don't have the teeth for it anyway. It grows out of those basic sort of world building questions, like, well, what do they eat, right? Well, I guess they have to be this way now because of the sort of ecological niche they occupy. So between that and sort of building up the sort of very formal warrior culture. And stuff like that. There was sort of the two threads. So the last thing I'll say is that like I had like 40 different alien species when I started, and I got rid of all the ones that I thought were like less cool, and I ended up keeping like two basically. I envisioned doing a more Star Wars thing at first, and then pulled back the amount of alien I was going to go with. So
next one, if you don't mind, this is a little more personally indulgent for me. I through my due diligence as a researcher here for an interview, found out we were from a similar area. We are both East Coast Southern boys. I'm from Virginia. You're from North Carolina, I believe.
Yep.
And I had an experience growing up. I was a stone's throw away from the Manassas battlefield that a love of history was probably born in you from that. It feels like, especially like that region, if you are a boy growing up there, you go on the tours, the battlefields, the histories. Did that play a big role in at least the angling of historic intent with Sun Eater?
Yeah, I think so to an extent. I wasn't nearly as close to a battlefield as you were, but I went to Bentonville a couple times to watch reenactments, which I thought was pretty cool, right? You've got the guys shooting blanks at each other, and the whole thing's full of smoke, and you're like, well, since no one's actually dying, this is awesome. I was always disappointed as a kid that Godzilla never wrecked Raleigh. I'm like, why is it always New York? Like, why can't nothing ever happens here? It's so boring. Now, of course, I feel very different. I'm glad that Godzilla has not wrecked my city at all. But you get this sense of like the concreteness of events, right? Which I think is easy to lose sight of in the modern world, that like these things you read about in books are real, right? And that leads to second order questions, because like you'll hear one story and then you'll hear another story, and sometimes those two stories are both valid perspectives, sometimes maybe less so, or whatever, right? And in the South, maybe this is probably a difficult conversation, right? Like what do you do, right? With the war is over, like how do you reconcile, right, these two sides, and like everybody's still living in the same place, right? And like that's a really tough one, and everybody's got their stories that sort of makes it so they can all feel like they can go on with their lives, but that complicates, everything. And from the storytelling perspective, like you don't need to care about what the truth is, right? You just like the mere fact that there's like this complexity, right, in people's perspectives, however valid or not valid they may be, is a really interesting sort of narrative thing to think about, right, from the perspective of fiction writing. You're like, man, I am not buying what you're selling, but it is interesting that you do, right? Yeah. Both sides at least are interesting in a historical, context, and you have to be able to look at every facet here, especially if you're trying to build a story, right? Because because if you don't, then it's just black and white in the story, and people are like, this is a little bit like, oh, now the aliens are just bad. Like, well, maybe humans aren't good either, right? Maybe that's more interesting. Maybe that's also more true, and so that gets me looking at like other periods of history. So like I'm the big Roman history buff, obviously, right? And so you go back and you look at people like, I'm fascinated by Caligula, because I'm pretty sure he wasn't crazy. I'm pretty sure they're all lying to us, because I'm pretty sure he bullied them. Like you look at the famous horse story, right? He makes his horse a senator, and he's like, he's a senator now, and the senator's like, can you believe this crazy shit that this guy did? It's like, well, he's making fun of you, actually, Marcus. He's saying his horse could do a better job than you. This isn't complicated, or the actions of a lunatic. Even the like crazy stuff. I read a book, I can't remember who wrote it, about Caligula, was saying that like the whole he wanted to marry one of his sisters thing was because he was trying to be a pharaoh. And the pharaohs did, and he was planning to move the capital to Alexandria to defang the Senate, because they would have had to stay in Rome, and then they wouldn't have been able to mess with him to the same degree. And the pharaohs married their siblings on a regular basis. Cleopatra was married to her like 12-year-old brother,
just ancient world stuff.
just normal stuff. Yeah, like obviously gross, but
Yeah,
like in context, you're like, okay, like maybe he wasn't a maniac. Maybe that's like he's trying to follow a precedent of god kingship that's very
correct.
different
Yeah.
than the Roman model, right? And so like you learn to go and look at everything that happens historically with sort of an extra set of glasses, right? And even if you end up discarding one of those perspectives, the fact that it exists will help you sort of understand those events, but they also help you in writing stories to write, your antagonists, whether they're good or evil, or with more complexity. And I think that's useful.
It's the individual justification, the cultural justification, the stories that people tell themselves. They're good stories sometimes. Like they may not be right, they may be twisted, but it's amazing how like you have to take a very dispassionate view. And I think that comes through in Sun Eater very well, where you play with the narrative of Hadrian, yes, but then there's also the narrative around him, the narrative around his crew, the narrative around the empire he serves. And it's like these layers of stories that from each individual different perspective in this empire, Hadrian's either the biggest villain operating or he's just a victim of court politics. And I remember specifically, especially when he's like trying to get more into the court politics really close to the emperor, there are these moments where he's like, how could you think that of me? And I'm like, Hadrian, how could they not think this of you? You are the scariest guy walking the solar system.
Yeah, no, 100%, right? And it's just funny because like the more you like step back and look at things, right, the less it's true, just period, right? Like almost everything is smoke and mirrors, right, in history books to some extent, right? Even the story is that like we all believe. I'm trying to think of like a very clear example, but the Caligula one is like that's a pretty inoffensive one. Like everybody thinks he's a crazy person, right? We have that Gore Vidal movie, right, with Malcolm McDowell, where he's baying at the senators, and but like probably he was wrongly maligned because you're reading the annals that were written by his political opponents, because only his political opponents could write, right? Like usually, you find these Roman emperors that people hate. It's because they're populist demagogues, and the Roman people actually loved Caligula because he spent money on parades and on like public work projects. It's very rare when you find an emperor that the nobility and the peasantry both like.
So the next question is probably one you've been asked a bajillion times, but I just got to know, and I want to see if I can squeeze out any additional information from you by phrasing it trickily. You are coming close-ish to the end of Sun Eater. You have just put out Disquiet Gods, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's one more book to be written before we're done. Are you allowing yourself to speculate, give effort towards the next big project? Are you wanting to stick in sci-fi fantasies or a horror epic in your future? Where is the creative juices for Ruocchio flowing?
Yeah, so I think what's going to happen is that the next thing will probably be a Sun Eater Universe standalone novel. I'm not 100% sure what it's going to be yet, but I think I'll do that first because I want to reassure everybody the universe isn't done. I'm not closing the whole thing down, switching the lights off on my way out. If I have a science fiction idea that will fit in the universe, I'll do it because there's no reason to reinvent a whole galaxy of shit. I do have a sci-fi idea that needs a new universe, but I don't think I'll do that for a while. I'm not that excited about it. Well, eventually, maybe I will be. But I have some fantasy ideas as well. I do have a horror idea. It is a Sun Eater novel, but I do have a horror idea. So we'll see. But I think the plan is going to be to sort of alternate between standalone novels for the next couple of years because I have a 9-month-old, and probably there will be more kids, and I don't want to get wrapped in another 7-book, 250,000 words per book giant project in the middle of that because it is. I was supposed to be done with this one before she was born, and that did not happen. I'm sort of trying to get through book 7 by waking up at 5 a.m. and working until she wakes up, and then working when she goes back to sleep. And the bigger they get, the less naps there are. And so right now it's pretty good, but come the end of the summer, I think I'll be done with book 7 by around August, September. By the time I get there, it might be harder and harder. So we'll see what happens.
As a very nice segue for me saying, as far as I'm aware, Sun Eater is back in stock if you're a physical reader. Thank you, Goblins, last time for literally buying it out, apparently. That's incredible. But now you can get the full series or just Empire of Silence?
So Empire of Silence is back in stock. Howling Dark is back in stock. Demon in White is out of stock right now, so we got that one. Good job, everybody. They're reprinting it. It should be out by the middle of March. They said that'll be back, and they reprinted 4 while they were at it. my publisher just wasn't prepared for like the 500-600% increase in sell through like overnight. And
We
so
got
we knew that
power.
we actually, I don't can't remember if I told you, we almost have sold out the second printing they did like of book one back in January. So they doubled how many they printed from the first one for the second one. That is almost gone. I got an email about a week ago where they said, "Hey, we're doing a third printing for book one now. We're printing even more just in case." So I think they've learned their lesson. You know, about betting against against you all. So well done, thank you. Because that was man, you don't talk about anxiety. Everybody's like, "Hey, I can't find your books," like 8 times a day, and I'm like, "Yeah, I know." Yeah, funny. It's
Sorry about
yeah,
that. I didn't mean to make
it's
your
great.
stress worse.
Yeah, oh, it's all right. And then everybody's like, "Man, it's a good problem to have," and you're like, "Actually, no, because you can't buy it." So being sold out sounds cool, but it's actually terrible.
I'll throw a coin in. I've read physical books for Sun Eater. The narration, some of the best I've come across. Samuel Rukin.
I think it's Rukin. I think
Yeah.
is how he says it. I'm not 100% sure.
I think it's the
I
first
haven't
book I've listened to from him. He's in my top 10 narrators now. Just wow, what a great find.
Yeah, he's super great. He's doing Elric now too, which
Oh,
I've never read those, but it is cool that Hadrian and Elric have the same voice.
with totally seamless transition in the edit back in time.
Right.
Don't be weirded out by this jarring edit. So the technology in the Sun Eater world is so magically treated. It is viewed as in some ways as being this like demons almost, whereas in other ways it's been so normalized, certain angles, certain avenues of technology that something that can be considered horrific in modern society is just what you do. How did this idea of making technology essentially magic come into existence for you, and where did you find the most ore mining away at this idea, because it's so intrinsic to the world building?
I think where the most ore is with artificial intelligence, right? Because computer programmers already use the word demon to describe some phenomena in computer programming. I always get what it is wrong, but the fact that the word is there at all is good enough for me. But you get a lot out of it because we already analogize computer issues to viruses, and viruses have also been analogized to demons as well, right? And so there's this linkage there that is totally fine. And if the virus is intelligent, right, and is making decisions, it is effectively demonic, right? Like it's got no body. And the more I was sort of pulling on this loop, I found that there or even sort of more connections, right? As if you have the AI, here's a very trite example, but like if the AI rebels against humanity, so too did the angels, right? And so you have all of these these little mythological resonances that sort of work here. And then when you have I set up an inquisition who really are just IT bros who are going through cleaning out your computers, trying to make sure that you don't have anything that talks back in there. Then suddenly you have a bureaucratic institution whose job it is to deal with all this stuff, and sort of that thread just you can keep going kind of indefinitely. But you pull that thread too, and like how does that affect how people think if it's in their heads, and like you've got the possession stuff going on. Like these are not maybe new ideas for science fiction, but I don't remember like what got me started on this. I mean, obviously Dune. So Dune doesn't have AI for the same reason that I don't have AI very prominently in the story, right? Which is that like if there's AI, then like what constitutes normal human civilization suddenly looks so different that you're spending a lot of wordage trying to explain it, right? And I wanted like stories are fundamentally about people, right? And the science fiction that's not, whether it's about like a bunch of weird aliens like we were saying, or if it's about robots or whatever, doesn't like get through to as many people. Like those books don't sell as well as Star Wars, right? Like even Star Trek is like more obscure than Star Wars is because it's dealing with weirder like sciencey stuff. Like there is a science fiction is a perception of being hard, and I think that part of that perception comes from the fact that fantasy has like a pretty established grammar, especially if it's like post Tolkien fantasy, in the sense that it's like following on the groundwork that he laid, right? If you've got elves and dwarves and orcs and goblins, you actually don't have to explain what any of those look like to people anymore. Fantasy readers have it down, but if you make up an alien, like, man, you've got to do work. And the same thing is true with technology. Magic, the expectation is that you can hand wave a lot more stuff. Less so in the current climate since hard magic is so popular. I have feelings about hard magic, but that's a whole other video. And but I wanted to sort of set a lot of the technological questions aside because I don't have that background, and you need to like world build to your strengths, right? An example of this I usually use is like I don't actually know anything about naval warfare or submarine warfare, right? Which is kind of how you should write spaceship engagements. So like, what do? Right? Oh, I make every space battle really a boarding action so that I can write sword fights because I do know about sword fights, and you do the same thing. Like I don't know a lot about nuclear physics or like space travel or about computer systems, and so you make world building choices that get you away from it. But once you've done that, there's a really interesting panel I sat on. My friend Dave Butler was running it, and Dave is a fantasy writer and he's a folklorist. I think he's like the best world builder going. Just absolute. He wrote a fantasy series that's set in a magical version of like 1800s America, and he like actually learned Ojibwe to write his native characters because like he wanted to do it correctly. And I don't know another writer who's done that. And it's the way he like took our world apart, put it back together, is so cool. And he's talking about how the word magic, right? It's a Greek word originally, right? Is sort of a slur because they get the word from the Persians, right, where the Magoi, the mages, right, the wise men in the New Testament, right, are these sort of Persian nobility, right? And so magic is what those, filthy foreigners are doing, right? We do the truth, right? We Greeks are practicing real stuff. Our oracles, that's not magic, right? That's just religion. Magic is a slur you use for outsiders. And it's a slur you use for things that you don't understand, right? And so if you don't understand technology, it is magic in that sense, right? This is like Clarke's third law kind of sense, right? And so magic in a Sun Eater context is a thing practiced by the barbarians, right? It's practiced by the extrasolarians, right? We don't understand what it is they're doing, but they are turning themselves into 8-foot tall metal spiders, and we hate that. So we use the word, magic, which means, thing that those crazy foreigners are doing. Because of course, the Persians were Zoroastrian, right? So they were praying to praying to Ahura Mazda, looking into the fires and stuff like that, and the Greeks are like, what is all this fake stuff? Like, I don't believe in that, right? And the reverse is of course also true, right? The Persians are like, what are these like Western rubes doing with their stupid bull sacrifices? Why don't we just take them over, Xerxes? You can see how like the basic principle is there, right? Like if this technology is mostly being practiced by like the outsiders, right? Then it's very easy to tar that as magic. But the technology that we're using, right, the eugenics, like that's totally licit, bro. It's fine. We can change people however we want, but the way that you want to do it, not cool, right? Because every society, does this, right? It draws a circle around itself and says, "This works. That is gross." Whoops. Perfect. I threw my headphones out. It's the Italian, man. Just too much hand talk.
I will jump back into our outro here completely smoothly. No jumping at all. Thank you so much, Chris, for swinging on by. I really appreciate it. And everyone, of course, books are linked right down there, as we said, back in stock. And have a beautiful day, y'all. Like and subscribe. Goodbye. And check out Christopher Ruocchio's YouTube channel as well. It's a great YouTube channel. So,
Yeah.
goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.